Welcome to our podcast called Flipping the Tin. We chat with event industry specialists, policy makers, and conference attendees on the future of events and conferencing. Today, we have two brilliant guests to speak about accessibility issues at academic conferences. Our first guest is Rachel. She is a research assistant at the University of Birmingham. She obtained her BA BSc in Deaf Studies with Psychology at the University of Wolverhampton in 2002, and a postgraduate certificate in Deaf Studies at the University of Bristol in 2008. Since 2011, she has been working as a research assistant on numerous projects across the UK, including the Syndrome of Vision Research Unit within Cardiff University, looking at the mysterious benefits of bifocals for children with Down syndrome. Prior to joining the University of Birmingham, she has also worked as an advocate at the British Deaf Association and as a research coordinator at the Arts Council of Wales. She has done much sessional work for the National Deaf Children's Society, which has included delivering training and hosting family events. Today, she's being assisted by the BSL to English interpreter. Hi, Rachel. Thank you so much for being here with us today. What has been your overall experience with in-person conferencing and accessibility?
Yeah, so before the pandemic, face-to-face conferences were fine. They went very smoothly and it was very easy to do. But then then the pandemic came with lockdown and we all turned to Teams or Zoom or different modes to, get access. And that became a problem for deaf people to be able to see the interpreter all of the time. Or maybe if there's another person who can sign as well, it doesn't matter. Everybody's signing all at the same time on these little tiny, stamp size pictures is very, very difficult. And then an extra problem is I wear glasses and I have a high prescription as well. And I need a very big screen. So looking at, so the visual problem and the deafness is a big problem. So I know it's very bad. We've sort of experienced for a lot of deaf people. We've just been thrown in there, having to learn it very, very quickly, learn how to pin somebody, looking at two screens at the same time if there's PowerPoints. So it's sort of like learning at the same time, learning your job as well. So it was quite a panic to start with. Sometimes when people are not deaf aware and sort of like there's an event going on, it's really difficult to follow or to keep up. So for example, some people, perhaps have finished speaking and then they ask if there's any questions. I might have my hand up ready, but there's always a delay with the interpretation. So sometimes I'm ready to speak, I've got my hand up, I'm ready to sign at the same time, but maybe the other person, somebody else has got in there before me. So then I step back and you can't get to say anything. So you can stand there with your hand up, but sometimes it gets missed. So you can put your hand up, but it will get missed a lot of the time. Or I might start speaking and then I'm obviously speaking over somebody else because they're still speaking. So it's really, really difficult, very difficult to create a system that's deaf friendly. I know sort of like Zoom meetings, when I know I've got a Zoom meeting coming up, I feel so stressed inside. I try to manage and I try to cope with it the best that I can, but I must say it's not at all deaf friendly. It's not very good. It creates an awful lot of stress and it brings the stress levels very high, and that's my experience.
Okay, thank you. That's unfortunate, but have you been able to attend any virtual conferences that were handled or were accompanying your needs?
Well, recently in Birmingham, I've got a workshop which involved 100 people or something like that. I know 100 people were allowed to be involved, to participate, but really I saw sort of like the dates coming up every week and the topic. I pinned the interpreter on the screen so I could see the interpreter, but as it was going on, I felt like I just couldn't cope with it. I just didn't feel like I was part of it. And I feel that sort of like for an academic for academic conferences, it's very important to be able to ask questions and to understand what's going on. But I just felt really excluded. So that's a big problem. So I didn't really go into any of the other sessions. Luckily, it wasn't part of my work. It was optional. I just wanted to get involved, which I normally would have done, but because it was online, it wasn't worth the stress levels. Before I've been involved in a workshop that was up to 40 people. I think there was about 40 had turned up, maybe 20, 30, 40, something like that. Sorry, I'd been in before. But one of the presenters on this, where there was 40, I knew them quite well. I knew the two colleagues as well, and they both had deaf awareness and they could both sign very well. But prior to the workshop, everybody was sort of like trained and says, please be patient with me, you know, that we need to pin and so on. So it could carry on. But then somebody just started speaking. I didn't want to be rude or anything, but I didn't know who was speaking because I was pinning the interpreter. And the rest went quite well. But normally, online conferences, when there's lots of people, say 100 or more or anything around there, you know, you can't pin them all, you know, so nobody really understands. They all need deaf awareness first. I mean, if there's 4 or so, that's absolutely fine. But once you've got lots of people on the screen at the same time, it is very, very difficult, especially when there's no deaf awareness. You know, sometimes they'll say, oh, right, we've got a deaf person here, so we all need to be aware of her needs. But really, there's no, you know, training or anything. And sometimes it's too late. You know, everybody just starts speaking at the same time. The interpreter can't follow. So it's very, very difficult, a big challenge actually for me as a deaf person.
I can understand that. And yeah, that's why we're here. That's why we're trying to kind of raise this debate and talk to and make conference organizers aware of your needs. Before we dive into that a little further, I'm going to introduce our second guest, who is Gerardo Ortega. He's a lecturer in the Department of English Language and Linguistics at the University of Birmingham as well. His research focuses on the sign languages of deaf communities and the gestures produced by hearing people. A key aspect of his work is how deaf and hearing people acquire a linguistic system expressed with the body and processed through the eyes. His investigations use various methodologies to better understand how the body contributes to human communications in different populations, deaf, hearing, children, and adults. Hi, Gerardo. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for taking the time. What has been your overall experience with in-person conferencing and accessibility before this pandemic hit?
Thank you very much for the invitation. Before the pandemic, I think that conferences in our domain were very well catered for people from all walks of life. So for hearing people and for deaf people as well. So we always made sure that, well, we were signers, some of us, and there were sign language interpretation. So it was easy to really communicate with people. Or at least we had experience of looking after all types of populations and look for the best way for them to communicate. But unfortunately, the pandemic really hit us very hard and very suddenly. And I don't think that we had like the technological, well, we didn't have the technology in general to really cater for all these people, for all populations. And it was really challenging to really catch up because of the different needs that we have. So we have these, we've had conferences online and virtual, but as Rachel was saying, it was incredibly difficult to really communicate and make it accessible to everyone, because if you think normally people interact face to face, so you are, whether you're hearing or deaf, you have your interlocutor in front of you and you can see all their bodily actions, and these are important cues. We know from research that these are very important cues to let the other person that you're going to take the floor and communicate, and the other way around. The body tells the interlocutor when this person has finished talking, and then it's the other person to reply. All of this is gone in a virtual environment. All of this is completely disappeared. And this is particularly more challenging when it comes to deaf people and the communication using a sign language, because if you consider that we are looking at a screen with lots of small screens for all the attendees. Some of them don't have their cameras on. Some of them are just not looking at the screen, so it's really difficult to know whether they're engaged in a conversation or whether they're typing or not. And on top of that, you also have usually a PowerPoint presentation. So, and then you also have a chat function. Just consider the number of things that are happening within this really tiny space. And if the vocal channel, if voice is not accessible to someone, then vision is the only sense that you can rely on. And of course, it is really challenging for anybody trying to catch up with people who are signing, people who are raising their hands, and then somebody writing on the chat, and then texting something, and then you have to read the slides. So there's just so much going on. And not only that, like Rachel was saying, if you consider that you're looking at a screen, and then the number of people, if there are more people, then it reduces the size of the person. You end up looking at an interpreter that is the size of a stamp. That is really difficult. That is really, really difficult, because our human body and our cognition is designed to look at like full bodies. That's how language evolved, because we are used to facing people in face-to-face interactions. So virtual reality, the virtual environments that we're working at are not really designed for communication where we can have access to the visual representation of the body, to see the interaction with others, and that really has a negative impact on communication. Definitely when with people who are hearing, but more so with deaf communities. And this is a huge problem, because if we really want to strive for a community that is accessible and it's inclusive, then we really have to do our best to cater for everyone.
Absolutely, absolutely. Have you been involved in organizing or attending any virtual conferences over the last year by now already, that you thought some things were happening in the right direction, or any other examples where you think this there was some thought gone into it already?
Yeah, definitely. I think that one of the things that I was involved in the organization of UKCLC, the UK Cognitive Linguistics Conference, and that was held virtually in the University of Birmingham, organized with some colleagues, Bodo Winter, Marcus Perlman, and Florent Perec. This was a really good conference, I think, and we used a really good platform. I found this was organized by it was planned by suggested by the organizing committee, and that was actually really, really successful. It allowed interaction with all the attendees. There were multiple discussion boards where people were interacting and they were posting and sharing papers, discussing ideas, and so on and so forth. The format of the presentation itself, I think, was it was somewhat successful, but unfortunately, even though we had sign language interpretation for some of the sessions, we faced these difficulties of not having full accessibility for everybody. So of course, if somebody was presenting, you would have to have the presenter, and then you would have another screen for the interpreter, and then you would also have like the slides for the presentation. So this is the best thing that could be done, but I don't think that it was the best accessible way. I don't think that it was easy, because let's remember, like Rachel was saying just a moment ago, a conference is not just like the presentation itself. It's also interaction. it's also having the ability to ask questions. It's also the ability of saying, I have a comment, I would like to make a remark. And if that is not visible, and if the presenter does not see who is raising the hands because of the number of screens that are available there, then this person is going to be forgotten in the background. So I think that one of the things that is really important for us to think forward if we are going to continue planning conferences virtually in the future is that we have to make sure that everybody's aware that not everybody has access to sound, and that we really have to make sure that there is some form of visual visibility for all of them. This is going to capture the attention of the presenter, and is going to make it a lot more inclusive.
Very interesting to hear about that. So for our listeners and for people at home and trying to look into these ways of making conferences more accessible to everybody. So what has been done within your research that we can take over to conferences to make them more accessible? Maybe start with Rachel here.
Well, personally, for me, perhaps the best idea I would have is to create something to make it accessible to deaf people, is perhaps have it led by a deaf person, because a deaf person would know how to pace the information, where a hearing person leading perhaps wouldn't know how to pace it, so they might go too fast or too slow. You know, if you haven't got that experience, it's hard to actually explain it to a person who's never been through it. But I think the most successful way would be to have it deaf-led, and they could control sort of like the pace of it. An academic participating perhaps in different softwares to have a knowledge about that and to have training on it. I was given some free online training myself, but inside I was anxious, I was nervous, because I knew that the teacher was hearing and she had got no deaf awareness. She'd never met or trained a deaf person before, but I needed to go to this training. And I knew inside straight away, I could feel myself straight away knowing I shouldn't try to do this, because it was there was extra challenge, because I had to watch the interpreter, I had to watch the screen of how to do things, because it was on software. So we had to watch how to do this IT thing that was being done. And I couldn't watch the interpreter, watch what they was doing, watch the presentation, listening at the same time. Hearing people would watch and then they would practice. But it was absolutely impossible for me as a deaf person to get access to this training. I couldn't keep saying, can you stop a minute, let me watch, and then watch the interpreter and then practice. It just wouldn't be practical. I think there was about 45 people who were involved at the time. Then the lecturer just jumped from one part to the next, and I had to very quickly just say in the chat box, I'm sorry, I need to quit. I can't follow. It's absolutely impossible for me to do it. And I did ask if we could do a one-to-one, and she was really lovely and says that would be absolutely fine, so that she'd be able to learn how to make it accessible to deaf people in the future. So she was getting some training from me as I was getting training for her. It was it was an impact for the trainer. And it was really, really good. And she learned very quickly that to keep saying, hold on a minute, let me look at this screen, then look at the next screen, instead of it flowing as it would for a deaf person. Then she did say that it was a big impact for her. So she learned very, very quickly of the differences between deaf and hearing, trying to train them online. You know, hearing people might pick up the information straight away, but for a deaf person, it's impossible. Deaf people aren't stupid. You know, it's just technology and how it's working at the moment that there's a problem, and it's not accessible to a person who is deaf like myself. I think in the future, perhaps online trainers, maybe if they were deaf-led, would perhaps be able to help, because they would be able to do the pace. So not a hearing person, who with no deaf awareness, because it would be very difficult for them to empathise and to know how to make the adjustments that are needed. So the best suggestion that I can say right now Also, I think also the limit of numbers that would be in the conference. I think that also has an impact. I know before I did a conference with Gerardo, and there was, I think it was about 40. So, and that worked quite well. So the presentation, the presenter knew how to control the times, how the pace and everything else. It was sort of like, sometimes it's just lost. For me, I think to be successful, you need to limit numbers, a deaf person to lead it as well, so they can control the pace.
Great, thanks for that, Rachel. Gerardo, have you seen, are there any techniques that you use within your research or that you have seen anywhere that you think could translate into these conferences and academic conferences in the wider sense?
Yeah, I first of all would like to just acknowledge Rachel's point. I think that very often people who organize this conference are very well intended, but they don't really have the knowledge or the understanding of how to be accessible. So normally abled people plan accessibility for disabled people, and I don't think that that should be the way. Deaf people should be involved in this case, or people who have a first-hand experience on what works and what doesn't. So I think that beyond any kind of research, this is one of the things that conference organizers, we should all take into account. But now, looking at research, I think that we have very, very strong evidence that says that, as I was explaining before, that humans were designed for face-to-face interaction. And of course, the things that are removed from this communication with online platforms can be adapted or can be modified so that they can help a little bit the ease of communication. So one piece of advice would be just something as simple as looking at the camera. We know from research that actually eye gaze is a very, very, very important cue to signal turn taking in communication. When the blink of the eyes, we as communicators, we look at the eyes and we acknowledge that the eye gaze is going to tell us when the person has finished communicating and when it's the other person's turn to take over. So when we have our cameras off and we're just like typing or doing something different, this is completely gone. So something as simple as just looking at the camera would really facilitate communication. Another really important point here is that we have to be aware that even though the technology can allow us to do several things at the same time, the mind has limited cognitive resources, and we cannot really pay attention to absolutely everything that is happening online. From my personal experience, when I've been teaching online, there are students who are texting on the chat, and there are some people asking questions, then there's like a symbol of raising your hand. So there's just, and I have to focus on the content that I am delivering. So there's just so much going on that even though the technology allows for it, that doesn't mean that the cognitive capacities of the human mind can keep up with everything that is going on. We have to consider that people who attend this conference have different abilities, different ages, different digital literacy. So we cannot just assume that because the technology allows us to do certain things, everybody's going to keep up with it. So this is, I think that probably just like, this would be like the two pieces of research that I would like to suggest, like making communication as face-to-face as possible, just like to try to recreate it as naturally as possible, just by looking at a camera, giving access to your bodily actions, looking at the eyes, and also trying to understand that we have limited cognitive abilities or capacities to keep up with everything that is happening on the screen, and that more is not always more. Sometimes less is more.
Very good advice, I think, there. We've highlighted a number of issues that have come to the front because of the pandemic with accessibility and pivoting to virtual. But have there also been any positives from moving to virtual? Have we been able to talk to colleagues that we haven't been able to talk to normally? What have been the positives in that sense? And I'll start with Rachel again there.
If it was like a small group, that would be quite positive, because you'd be able to catch up with people. You can catch up with people anywhere in the world at any time. But for large groups, I'm sorry to say this, but I can't think of any positives at all for a large group conference. Let's say small groups might be better. But also, I think, all right, a positive would be you can show people across the world about deaf awareness, and perhaps then, you could say, oh, it's a new topic, Zoom, it's more relaxed for hearing people, that is. And maybe they might understand and realise now the concentration that you need looking at Zoom, that can hurt the eyes, and that's very, very much like a deaf person's world. So perhaps if they have to rely on Zoom as well, so it's hurting their eyes. So maybe that's a positive, more of an impact, more deaf awareness. I think training as well, and that's needed. For me, that's realise about the online training is needed. It doesn't matter about the pandemic or not. Training needs to be there to give an impact to different people about different situations and perhaps develop from there. And that would develop more deaf awareness and support people develop and achieve different jobs. So I guess that's a positive in a way, making people more aware of what it is that's going on. But I can only repeat again, these large group conferences, I'm afraid, as I say, you're not going to get a deaf-led one, or very rare. I have followed a deaf-led group before, but everybody was deaf on the group, on the Zoom meeting, so they all had deaf awareness, and it was deaf-led, so that people would stop and say, oh, can you see me? Did you see what I've just said? And the pace was aimed at deaf people, so it's a massive problem with deaf awareness. So, as I'm sorry to say, I can't really think of many positives. Sorry about that.
That's about live conferences predominantly, I think, as well. But what about when event organizers record the sessions and transcribe them professionally afterwards, and still allow you access to ask questions afterwards and continue engagement through text-based? Is that something that you think could help increase accessibility to conferences that you would normally not be able to attend, because they are far away, or because your budget wouldn't allow for you to travel that far?
Well, after the training with the lady that I told you to, she had recorded it, and that did help me to watch it later on. It was almost like my notes, so it reminded me of what it was that I'd learned. But the problem with videos training, you're talking of 1.5 hours trying to remember everything that you've learned. So after 1.5 hours, she was struggling to be able to send me the information. She didn't know how to do that. So she had to Google it and spend time to learn how to be able to send the information. Yes, so just going back, she recorded the sessions. It was 1.5 hours long. She says that she'd send it me later, a link on Google Drive, but I hadn't got a Google account. So we had to ask her if there was a different way that she could send it. That we could have it transferred, but it was too large to transfer, and we hadn't got the money to pay for anything. So she says try and save it. So she was saving it on the computer, and then it wasn't allowed to be saved. The Birmingham University is very strict on viruses and what you save on there, so it wasn't allowed to download it. So it was quite stuck, really, being able to get access to the recordings of it. So until that gets developed, so in theory, yes, that's a great idea, but then, where are you going to keep this recording? Where are you going to put it? How can you access it? You can't keep. And Skype as well. I've tried Skype with an interpreter and have that recorded, but it takes away a lot of the broadband. You need a very strong broadband. If it's not strong enough, that can be a problem as well. So you can't always get the interpreter because it keeps freezing on screen. So these are a lot of the problems that I'm seeing. So I don't know if it's appropriate or not, because there are quite a few problems.
Yeah, that's good to think for us to think about as well, and to keep in mind. Gerardo, for you the same question. Did you find any positives in the move to virtual, or Have you had similar experiences to Rachel?
Over the last couple of years, there has been a really strong drive in academia to make science open and accessible to everybody. So we tend to be like, put our data and our research in open repositories and so on. And actually the pandemic, one of the positive things that has brought is to make science more accessible to more people. And in this sense, I'm probably not talking about like in the sense of communication, but like to reach broader audiences. Given that at the moment all the conferences and all the talks that used to happen in specific locations, and people had to travel to the US or to Europe or to Latin America or to Australia or to Hong Kong, that had a tremendous cost for a lot of people. And unfortunately, attendance to academic conferences became a luxury for rich universities and for rich academic institutions. Now, one of the things that we're seeing is that given that everything is online, people don't need to pay £2,000 to travel to the other side of the world. They don't have to pay a tremendous registration fee because there is no catering, there is no coffee. Everything is happening in everybody's living room. So I have seen that definitely one of the positive things of these online conferences is that people from all over the world can attend. The cost has reduced significantly. Sometimes there is no cost at all for people. And that really helps the main purpose of science, to make it accessible, or at least accessible in one form to a lot of people. Yeah, so that is definitely one of the things that has been positive. And also one of the other things is that people have been thinking more about how to make all these talks or all these poster presentations available for people in the future. So another positive thing that we've been seeing, and it's not something that we didn't really think before, is to record the lectures, transcribe them for people, have a sign language interpreter, whatever the sign language is. So it is not that it was not possible before, but the pandemic cornered us to really do it and to make it happen. So now one of the positives that I see is that in many countries talks are interpreted, recorded, transcribed for people to use. Recently we had a workshop here in Birmingham, and this is exactly the format that we had. We broadcast live on YouTube. There was BSL interpreter live for this session, and the interpreter was right next to the presenter so that it was equally accessible to everybody. And then there was also speech-to-text transcription. And all of these resources are now available online for free for everybody. Of course, we didn't think about this before. It's funny that actually a pandemic had to make us think about this, but fortunately it is happening now. And at least I see that in Birmingham, we are making sure that this is a practice that we continue for the future. So definitely one of the positives of the pandemic is that we were forced to think and to implement accessibility for people.
That's great. That's good to hear. That's that there's some strides toward being made towards that. Has it, Rachel? This is a question for you. The pandemic has affected all of us in numerous ways, but has it affected your networking abilities? Have you been able to do some of that within the conference context, or has that completely fallen away for you?
Well, I would say that before, one part of the conference that would be important was be networking. It'd be quite important for me, and asking questions, seeing the presenters, making comments, being part of all of that, putting your view out there and linking that to the topics. Or maybe people are speaking, about the research, what I'm doing, what they're doing. You just get that chit chat going to understand about life and what's going on. But then that's been a problem. So if like it was led by a deaf person and it was the pace of a deaf person, it would be fine. I'd probably be able to cope. But if it's hearing person who's leading it, it's more problematic, and it's very difficult for me as a deaf person to participate. The problem is, or if I'm really honest, it's quite easy for me to just sit back and say nothing and watch all my colleagues asking and making the comments and hoping that one of them will ask a question that I'm thinking about, you know, and then I can think, all right, great, it's been covered now. But at the same time, you know, sometimes you can ask questions afterwards. You know, sometimes they say, well, stay along if you want. I want to ask questions afterwards. Sometimes that might be possible, sometimes not. But sometimes I don't answer if it's not deaf-led or not controlled by a deaf person or a person who's aware of deafness. So as I said before, I just stand back because I've tried to put my hand up and it gets missed. It depends on the energy on the day, really. You know, if I can put up with all the barriers, if I've got enough energy, because it does really wear me out. And if sort of like it's a positive day and I've got a lot of energy going, you know, I might be more forceful and keep trying to put my part in there. You know, but I know sometimes people need to wake up. You know, you set an alarm and it sort of like goes off and people wake up to that, and it's almost like that's what we need, because emotionally it's draining, physically it's draining. You know, it's almost like a step back. We need our strength to sort of like keep coming forward and saying, don't forget us, but you keep coming forward and getting knocked back, it's draining.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. Gerardo, have you been able to network in the way you were before, or what have you seen in during the pandemic in that sense?
That's a really important question, and I think that the answer will depend on the personality of the person you ask. I'm traditionally like old school, and I definitely like attending live conferences, because there was a lot of the things that you learned were from just like the chit chat and the coffee break, or having lunch with someone, or grabbing a colleague to ask questions, just like this informal conversation that happened afterwards, that was really, really fruitful and very, very useful. And it actually really led to some collaborations, sharing knowledge about certain research that we weren't aware of. And just the bouncing of ideas in an informal setting is really, really useful to really help clarify certain concepts, but also to come up with new projects. So that I personally find that is really missing, and I definitely cannot wait until we have the opportunity to do this. In a working setting as well, like Rachel and another person used to work in the same group, and I always like to be together with them, because we would really, just by discussing things at lunch, we would just know a little bit more about each other. It would create cohesion in the team. We would come up with ideas of things to do and so on. So that is gone when you are working remotely from home, right? It's draining, like Rachel says. It's really draining to be attached to the computer all the time. So I personally miss this lack of ability to really communicate and interact informally with people, because that's also what makes us human, right? That aside, other personalities I've seen that really engage in this type of platforms. Very often in the conferences that we organized in the UK, had these discussion boards, and there was this chat options, and there were people who were just like texting away their lives and sharing stories and talking about personal experiences and their research. And people who were traditionally very quiet to ask a question in the public domain, like in a face-to-face conference, they were very vocal, or they were very communicative in the text format. So I think that it really depends here, as I was saying at the beginning, who you ask and the personalities. Some people may feel more comfortable at just typing a question and interacting with people online. Some other people like me, I really prefer just the face-to-face interaction. Maybe I'm older and I'm not so used to this kind of in the texting. So I think that you can find both ways. You can find people find it easier to communicate and express and interact and ask more questions. Some other people are more inclined to have face-to-face interaction. I'm in that group, I have to say.
Yeah, that's where we hope also, I think hybrid events are going to come in to alleviate some of that. I think, Rachel, you wanted to add something.
Yes, I just wanted to say what Gerardo just says about the preference of face-to-face. And I see that, and I've been using the chat box more because I've realised it's the one way to get the questions out. If like I raise my hand, it gets missed or ignored. So I've been using that more, and I feel that's quite a strong way to get a question over there, just to put it in the chat. I know recently some staff network meeting at the university happened, and there was too many people there, so I didn't bother putting my hand up trying to interact or to speak to anybody, and I just put my points into the chat, and that worked quite well. So maybe that's a positive thing I can say, actually, as an academic, a deaf person with working in there, it was a good way to try and get in access and to communicate with people. But I am like Gerardo, I like to look at body language, I like the face-to-face, I like the personal touch, I like that humanity of it all, really.
Absolutely, yeah, I understand that. That's both you highlighted as actual research as well, all about. So, so I want to take it back to the fact that digital is going to be here to stay even after the pandemic. Hopefully we'll get into a time where we can organize hybrid events, which will have a physical aspect, and some people who are not able to be on site with us due to numerous reasons will be able to follow online. But how do conferences make people more deaf aware? Where does that start? We've talked about having deaf people being involved in the organization. That's a great thing. And I think absolutely for larger conferences with bigger budgets, they should always have an accessibility consultant in that sense for somebody that is with first-hand experience. But what about the smaller academic conferences that don't have that much budget, but do really want to make them as accessible as possible? How can we give them some practical tips to really start that process? Rachel, your expertise, I'll start there.
Well, it doesn't matter really, because you've always got somebody who's there who's deaf always, and that's part of their work, which means that deaf people, if they're funded from work, then there'll be funding for an interpreter, so access to work. But if that wasn't there, like a conference would worry about relay access, getting the access and things like that, which means really, if there's no budget, if you ask a deaf person to participate or to lead a conference, or they'd like to create something or create their own one, or deaf education, or to give training before the conference actually happens. I know a lot of online stuff now, and there's a minimum of 80% is online now, and it's sort of like for training. So that's a tick to say that it's happened. But perhaps before the conference, perhaps you should say that they've watched or done something on this step awareness that can be free now, and then you can tick a box to say that they've got it, as well as they'll all know. And maybe at the end there could be a little bit of a test just to make sure that they're deaf aware, and to make sure that they can sort of like participate, whether that's a leader, somebody who's presenting something. It would just be nice really, to ask a deaf person if they want to lead something, or if they'd like to chair a meeting. There would be no cost, because the interpreter would be paid for out of the access to work budget, which comes from the government. So they wouldn't have to pay for that. So sort of like it would be able to be, accessible then for a deaf person at no extra cost to yourselves.
Gerardo, do you have any actual tips for people who are organizing conferences and might have deaf people and want to just make them as accessible as possible? and be open to deaf and hard hearing people.
Yeah, I think that I'm just going to emphasize first again this the importance of involving deaf people in the organization of this kind of conferences, especially if we're definitely going hybrid in the future. There's always going to be a deaf person there, so it is really important that we bear that in mind, and just like to have some ideas, some suggestions that would be really useful. This involvement, as Rachel says, will bring in like an interpreter that could be facilitated through access to work that is sponsored by the paid for by the government. So in that sense, the budget issue kind of gets mitigated. In addition, I think that it's very useful for people to also like do recordings. Like if it is possible to make recordings with subtitles, that would enhance the visibility of the conferences and to make it accessible to people after that's taken place. Another possibility would be just asking the presenters to make their slides available in an open access format for people to read in preparation, or just to have like some sort of concrete resources to just like follow the main the core of the talk. And generally speaking, I think that another possibility would be speech to text. I think that could be live, or it could be just subtitles afterwards for the talk. But generally speaking, I think that in an ideal world, an interpreter would be the best thing through these means that I have said before. But all the others, like pre-recording, subtitles, speech to text, and making slides available to the public would be very, very useful in preparation for the conference. So just like making the slides available there. I think that we need to be trained or change our minds as our mindset as academics, because we typically just finish our presentation on the minute or just 30 minutes beforehand. We just need to be made aware that if we really believe on accessibility, we have to get our materials ready beforehand. We have to send them to interpreters. We need to prepare a talk and get it ready for subtitling and so on. So we just have to contribute from our part with a little bit of extra work beforehand, just to make it accessible to the world.
That's some amazing tips there, and I think that's definitely something people should all keep in mind, not just in the academic realm, but also outside of that. Just wanted to ask, I'll stay with Gerardo before I move on to Rachel again. It's how do you think the pandemic has affected conferencing in the long term? Like you briefly touched upon hybrid there. How are we going to do academic conferencing in 5-10 years? What will it be? What will it look like?
Yeah, my prediction is that we're definitely going to stick to hybrid for the rest of the from now on, for many reasons. Just to give you an example, here in Birmingham, even before the pandemic hit, we were already worried about the impact of the environment. So to the point that we said that if people were coming by train, they would get like a discount in the registration fee, because we wanted to encourage people to use trains instead of planes, which are more highly pollutant. And now with this, I think that it would be really irresponsible to go back to encouraging people to fly and continue polluting the world. At least in Birmingham, we are very aware that we want to keep things accessible to people, so we are broadcasting things live, but also we're going to try to limit the amount of travel that people are going to be doing, because it's expensive and it's bad for the environment, and we have seen that there is no need for that. Of course, we're missing out on face-to-face interaction and the chit-chat by the coffee table, but I think that those are things that we will adjust to that. So my prediction is definitely we're going to continue doing some form of hybrid conferences. There will be the possibility to attend physically, but I think that there's also going to be a strong component of keeping it online for everybody.
Thanks for your predictions there, Gerardo. Rachel, what do you think? What's the future of academic conferencing in your? What do you think?
Well, in my last job, it was I had a big screen in the meeting room, and they would use that for remote meetings because people were based all around Wales. There was, I think, 3 different regions, which meant that every week they could have these team meetings for all over Wales. And that was before the pandemic. So, and it worked for them. So I think for the future, I can see it like more project developing like this. So maybe it's different universities getting together and things like that. So Birmingham working perhaps with a different university in Germany, like we do at the moment in Cologne. We have our own sorts of laptops at work, and that is a challenge. But maybe in the future, we could perhaps, if we go back to Birmingham into the office, we could perhaps start developing research of how we could get big screens, perhaps a great big, an 80-inch one or something like that. So then you'd be able to carry on having these meetings all over the world and be able to see people clearly, because you'd have 2 big screens maybe, and make it more accessible that way. There'd be plenty of space. If you've got the space, then why can't you do this? You could have these big screens. So maybe that's something that could be done, and some research on that, and perhaps that could be in collaboration with the rest of the world about these screens. I think that could be a positive thing. We could learn from the pandemic and what's been missing and what we can do for the future.
That's good to hear. I'm going to ask you the question, Rachel, like, what is your hope for the future of academic conferences, before I ask the same one to Gerardo? What do you hope they're going to be like, not what you think they're going to look like?
Well, I know Gerardo likes the old-fashioned way. Like me, we like face-to-face. You can have that catch-up, have a chat over tea and cake and things like that. I like that, and I like that way, just like Gerardo, but and that's to me the normal way. But also I think there's more learning opportunities to develop different training and make it more accessible to world conferences. As I've mentioned before, with big screens, so you can all go to one place, one room, you're still there, and you can still access things, and it'll be a lot easier. So you can see everybody, and you'd still be, can all be sort of together. And I think that might work well. Sometimes maybe if a lecturer in a lecture theatre, and they've got a big screen there and they put PowerPoints up, you could use that for conferences. You could manage something like that. So you get the audience in the lecture theatre as they come in, and they sit down and work it through that way. You can have an interpreter there as well. So I think maybe for me, I can see the possibility of both, the hybrid way. So perhaps still face-to-face, but some online. I think that is the hope, really, because you get more learning opportunities. You don't have to travel around the world to do it like Australia. I wouldn't have been able to do that on a flight for 24 hours, and then you need your break with your jet lag, and then you do your conference, and then you've got to come back. You've got the flight again for 24 hours, and you need your rest, and you're off work for all of this time, just to get over it as well. But if you could all go to one room, sit there with a big screen, you're off one day to attend the conference, and you've got all this extra learning, and that'd be quite powerful. So perhaps that's the future that I'd hope for. So, if technology could improve to facilitate something like that.
That would be great. Absolutely. And I think that's where we are going for in the future. And that's what we are trying to advocate as well. Gerardo, for you, the same question. What do you hope they're going to look like, and how accessible are they going to be?
I think that my hope is pretty much where we are heading towards. Hybrid, for the reasons that I explained before. I really value, not only for personal reasons, but for also like the possibilities that it opens: face-to-face communication, the chit-chat, the sharing ideas, the interaction, the networking, the socializing with people. I think that this is really what makes a scientific community thrive, right? This kind of interactions is really, really important. So I really want to just like highlight it, that it has a value, and it is not just like for pleasure to meet your friends, but it really has a scientific value. I think it's important. So I hope that very soon we can meet our colleagues from other disciplines and, be in a physical conference at some point. But that said, I also really want that we take the positives that we have discovered in this type of in this situation, to make it accessible not only to people who cannot hear, like deaf people, but make it accessible to everybody who doesn't have the financial funds, the financial means to pay for, to travel to Australia, to travel to the US, to travel to Europe in general. Because science, at the end of the day, is for everybody. It's for the benefit of humanity, and it shouldn't be like a luxury. It shouldn't be a commodity. So I really hope that we can keep all those elements, continue with accessibility for absolutely everyone, but with and make it online and available for people. But also, we really hope that we can also have the possibility to see face-to-face interaction.
Absolutely, and that's really what we stand for here at Sardines Digital Engagement. We're really trying to open that up to the world, those academic conferences, and to democratize knowledge sharing and networking opportunities, so everybody has equal chances. I think what's left today is to thank my speakers, my wonderful speakers, Rachel and Gerardo, so much for their insights. I've really learned a lot, and there's a lot of things I'm going to have to think about, and our listeners when they're organizing conferences as well. So I really hope this has an impact. I also like to thank Julia for interpreting for Rachel today. That is very, it's been very great, and ensuring that we can have this conversation. Again, thank you both, and I hope to see you again at another conference or at another interview at some point.
Thank you very much for this.
Thanks,
guys.
You're welcome, and thank you for inviting us.